it's very important when we're talking about the stress response to define what that means, because stress these days really gets bandied around as a word that is something bad happening. Like stress in and of itself is something bad, something unwanted, something unhealthy or detrimental to us. But stress in and of itself is simply a provocation to a challenge. It's a call to act or react. So it is the opposite to not doing, the opposite to being simply restful or not bringing up energy or motivation towards something. So it's very important when we talk about it to recognize it is neither good nor bad. It's not a judgment word. What is can become to either healthy or unhealthy realms is how it affects us after the event, how we come down again, how the stress is within the whole picture of our long-term story, about whether it can actually start to have that that label healthy or unhealthy. So we'll have a look at what these things mean and how we can have this understanding of the stress response so that we can really recognize that which it does here, that which is part of the autonomic nervous system, that which is getting on with it in the background. So we don't have to think about these regulations, these orchestrations of bodily processes that are all tied up in things like digestion, blood pressure, heart rate, urination, defecation, our pupillary response, our breathing or respiratory rate, sexual response, body temperature, metabolism, electrolyte balance, so balance of our fluids and of the minerals that allow us to have our nerve communications, and production of bodily fluids, including sweat and saliva, our secretions, which are so important for our functions and our responses, and emotional responses. So that one's last, the emotional responses, after a long line of those which are discussing what we might say are more biochemical responses. So that's really key to recognize that we don't just have physiological response here or emotional response here. We are always completely and utterly intertwined with these. And this beautiful scheme or picture of the autonomic nervous system here really shows that up. This is particularly our parasympathetic and sympathetic branches, these two branches of the autonomic nervous system. Those nerves which come from the brain, the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, and how they talk to all of our organs, all of the things that we are taking in our senses with, and regulating and orchestrating all of those biochemical processes. So we can intrinsically know that if we have an emotional response, it ripples through all of those physiological, and if we have a physiological response, then it prompts how we change and how we feel about the world around us through our emotional responses. So we'll look at what these parasympathetic and sympathetic branches mean within the autonomic nervous system and what this means in terms of our stress responses and our relaxation responses. So firstly, the sympathetic nervous system, so one of those two branches of the autonomic nervous system, is the one that is mostly gets referred to as fight or flight. It sometimes gets referred to as fight, flight, freeze, but freeze is part of something else, and I'll talk about that in different excuse me, and again, go back again, in different presentations later. It's kind of worthy of a whole looking at itself. So a sympathetic nervous system is that which we might think of as fight or flight, and that refers to the fact that it's quick response mobilizing. So when we're talking about it in the realms of our survival response, that is whether we are running away from something or whether we are standing our ground and fighting, essentially, or at least posturing to fight, which is what most animals do in the wild, because fighting actually runs the risk of being really hurt. and either bleeding to death or having an infection, two things which are, you know, extremely detrimental if you're living in the wild. So these two mobilizing actions that we have for survival, get the hell out of here or stand your ground, are really deep primal responses. And they're the responses that we are playing out through our physicality, even if we are having this kind of stress response that I mentioned before, that's really part mostly of our landscape in the 21st century in particular, of psychosocial stress. So that is much more related to our psychology, our social environment, our group situations, our social interactions with others, where we stand in the pack, how understood or not we feel, how much we feel listened to, all of those kind of social machinations. And yet we are responding to those psychosocial factors as if we were still responding on this very primal, old, ancient level, which is either to run away or to stand our ground. So it's a very important thing to realize about the stress response, that yes, we can, a lot of it is ruminating for us as humans, and it involves hypervigilance, or, you know, vigilance where we're tracking and we're looking out for whether we're safe or unsafe. But our body, our physiology, is getting ready for something bigger. It is getting ready for something that is a large physical response. And that large physical response of the stress reaction is expecting that to be big, broad motion. This is really key when we look to do, you know, kind of practices that we will do in terms of the somatics and the really refined stuff within a quieter yoga practice, which is moving away from just going to big limb motions. And yes, it's great to do those, and they're really key for our health to be able to move our limbs in big ways. But when we're only doing those as part of feeling that we need to protect ourselves from something, we are keeping that communication up, that we need to keep doing the big stuff because we must be in danger. There's a perception of danger, even when that is not true of the very situation that we find ourselves in. So we can get caught up in these stress responses, be playing these around, and often be kind of stewing in a soup of stress hormones that come from these survival responses. And those are noradrenaline, adrenaline, cortisol. And adrenaline and noradrenaline are much quicker. They're protein hormones. So we produce those in response to an immediate need for protection. We don't need to have those in our body. They're protein hormones, so they're released very quickly and only have a finite amount of time in the body. And they're like rocket fuel. They tend to be not something that we want to have around all the time. So the stress response is kept up for longer than around an hour, then we will produce the steroid stress hormone cortisol in response, which is much longer term. It's a steroid fat-based hormone, and it's part of our circadian rhythm. We need cortisol, gets us up in the morning. It's motivational. It's the stuff that gets us doing things. I mean, as is adrenaline, but that's much more reactive. But this is an important part of saying that, you know, the stress response isn't simply bad. You know, we need to have this energy, this motivation, this excitation present. We just don't need it to be the only state and the one that's really running the show, even when it's not appropriate. And what's important to recognize within that stress response and production of those stress hormones is that is inflammatory. Inflammation is part of the stress response, because like I said, around this either standing your ground or running away, those are situations where we could either be wounded and we could bleed to death, or infection can get straight into the bloodstream through that wounding. So we need inflammation present to both seal any potential wounds and to bring immune components to a wound. So inflammation, just like vigilance, is a prophylactic, a preempting a self-protective mechanism. And again, if stress stays up, inflammation can stay up. It can be part of an inflammatory pattern.